There's a misconception around you need to think outside the box. So flawed. You don't think outside the box, you think within multiple boxes.
Futurist and global speaker Craig Wing.
To say, well, how do we help you understand that and help you create the kind of business that you want?
Some of his clients include Google, Airbus, Microsoft, Discovery, BMW.
Do we prefer innovative businesses or do we prefer businesses that create jobs?
How do we redefine value?
It's simple. Value is not defined by you.
Wow.
This is the paradox of entrepreneurship. When you think about an informal entrepreneur, the value of a rand isn't 1 rand. Economic theory tells us. The value of a rand is worth how many times it changes hands. You can be anything you want, but you can't be everything. Okay? So you can be anything because the world right now is one of choices. It's one of bandwidth. There's a lot of optionality right now. So you can be anything, but we're still only limited by 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, maybe 100 years. We need to be moving into a question of how. How do you think about the future differently is more important than what does the future look like.
I'm so mad, so I'm making a difference. I'm so mad, so I'm changing the sequence. I'm so mad, yeah, so I'm making a difference. I'm so mad, yeah, so I'm changing the sequence.
Great. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to have Craig Wing, the right Craig Wing, not the rugby player, right?
Absolutely right, Peter. I appreciate it, yeah.
Do you get that a lot?
I do. I get that a heck of... Well, actually, not as much because, I mean, obviously we're not in Australia, so they don't know me. But I actually use it as a mean to open up all my presentations because, we're in a digital world right now. So people go in and they say, hey, who are you? They Google and they tend to find this other Australian rugby player who looks a little bit different to me. And there are times where I make jokes about going up there, showing the same slide, and a bit of a chuckle from the audience. So no, in general, publicly, no, not really, but I do use it by means of presentation introductions.
So some might say you're the better looking one.
Well, that's what I like to think. I like to think that I'm the better looking, charming, wittier, but it's all subjective at the end of the day.
That's great. So when you look at your life and what you've been involved in for the past 10 years and looking ahead for the next 10 years, how would you summarize what you do, your mission, and all of that?
It's a great question. So for the last 10 years, I've really been working in this future space, right? In terms of the written definition, shall we say, right? If you were to pull out a business card that I had in the past, it would have said futurist. Now, futurist is not as some people deem, which is you can tell the future, it's about prediction, it's not about that. Fundamentally, a futurist in this context is about saying, how do we think about the future from different perspectives to determine what is the optimal strategy to succeed, right? So that's kind of been the post. What does it mean moving forward? Well, I'm sure we'll dig into this interview. There's a number of different things coming through, like my PhD, my startup research, etc. But probably for the next 10 years moving forward, it's about saying, well, how do we create systems in place to allow me to quantify the future?
This is great. This is really great. I guess my next question for you is that the world that we're living in now is we're experiencing rapid change. How do we keep up with all the changes? Because everything that's happening, you wake up today, you have gray hairs that you don't know where they came from, and there's new technologies that are being introduced. How do we keep up?
It's a great question. So obviously, and you've had a number of guests, obviously, previously before, they've spoken around exponential, the changes of where we are. They've no doubt spoken about the intersection of multiple S-curves and the speed of technology. I'm sure even on this podcast, you've heard terms like VUCA and Tuna, Benny, and whoever knows what else may be, right? A lot of this is then predicated around a key principle. There's multiple key principles. Probably the biggest one over here is if you think about the rate of disruption in terms of where the world's going, vis-a-vis whether it's technology, whether it's demographic trends, whether it's anticipated changes of customer or socio-political, whatever it may be, right? But the rate of change of the world out there, you need to at least be equivalent as an individual. If not, you're left behind, right? So that's the first obvious observation. How do you do that? How do you keep up with the level of disruption? A lot of folks would say this. They'd say, well, you need to read broadly and you need to understand and you need to think about things outside of your own context, connect all the dots. It's about things like combinatorials. They'll say, you've heard these kinds of terms before. For me, the practicality and the pragmatism around that is this. In as much as you can learn as quickly as you hope to learn out there, you won't, right? Because the practical nature of it is we only have 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So what is the right way of doing it? It's by saying, well, why do I need to understand this? And how does it affect me? You got to choose your battles, as they say, right? It can't be all about saying, hey, I'm going to learn everything out there. So on the one hand, while I broadly agree with the statement, we need to change as quickly as the world is changing, it's going to be impossible, specifically as things move faster and faster and faster. No doubt you've heard about the BMIs, Elon Musk and all that kind of stuff, brain-machine interfaces for your listeners and those folks that don't know about that. And the real reason why he's keen on that is because his view is, when you think about the speed of change vis-a-vis AI, it's not so much the speed of change, but it's the communication speed, right? So he calls it the baud rate. And basically what that means is AI systems have the ability to communicate with each other or internally, depending on how you look at the paradigm, quicker than we as human beings. And so one of the reasons why he wants a brain implant is the ability for us to say, how do we communicate and then how do we share information at least at the same speed as the machines do? You can't do that as a flesh and blood human being. You have to do that through technology, right? That for me is an indicator that says no matter how hard you change with the exponential rise of speed out there, you will actually never get as quickly as we think we need to. Right? Wow. By implication, it means you need to pick and choose. The obvious question, which I'm sure we'll get to later, then how do you pick and choose? But fundamentally what that says then is by understanding the world is changing, how do you toggle, how do you choose what's necessary, and how do you pick your battles?
Such a great response, eh? So with all this change, how do I future-proof my business? How do I future-proof myself? How do I future-proof my business?
There's many different ways of thinking around this whole concept around future-proofing, right? One is folks will say stuff also like, you need to be able to bring in multiple inputs. And I don't disagree with these. I think they're all right? But by a quick summation, there's many other views. One of them is by having diversity of thought, bringing diversity of thinking, whether that's age, whether it's sex, whether it's consultants, whether it's different views. There's a view around that. There's a view around saying, how do you think beyond single extrapolation of the past into the future? You've heard this one as well. I'm certain about it. The challenge with extrapolation of the past into the future is it's predicated around the belief that our past is an indicator of the future. So most individuals and organizations, because it runs true for both, say, what have we done historically and how do we then extrapolate into the future? It's a drag and drop exercise in Excel. Right? So they say revenue at 10% for the last 5 years, we'll carry on growing at 10%. Right? We'll cater for this, we'll tailor for this by some metric because of economic slowdown or headcount, or the case may be. But fundamentally, it's a single view of the future. The problem is a single view of extrapolation of the future is fraught with problems because there's stuff that you don't see. As the saying goes, you can't see around corners using a single view, right? So that's the first thing. Then you'll have other folks who say, well, then what you need to do is you need to use tools like foresight. And foresight's essentially about saying, here you are today, and saying, what does the future look like based off different tools and different approaches? That could be scenario analysis, that could be Delphi, that could be scanning, that could be science fictioning. It could be a whole bunch of different tools. Primarily, it's about saying, where are we today in 2023, which is the date that we're recording this, or the year we're recording this, and what does the world look like using these different tools? So that's the different view. And you go from a single view into almost an infinite view of the future. And this is where things become complicated, because future-proofing yourself is not about prediction. It's not about picking something and saying, this is where we're going. And this is where myself and my colleagues, shall we say, in this space who do trends, we probably share different views. Once something becomes a trend, it becomes mainstream, okay? And then by and large, you get a better chance of it succeeding, but you're also not guaranteed to be right. I'm sure you've seen the picture. Think about the early 2000s. There was a picture of a train station in Japan, or it could have been Korea, probably Japan. Yes. And they've got the QR codes on the wall. Yes. And they take a picture and they go, take that picture. By the time you get home, the groceries are delivered, right? Yes. So that was, let's call it 2005 to make things simple, right? So we're now talking 18 years ago. That hasn't arrived in South Africa. Right? So what does it mean? It means by way of prediction, prediction's not right. A more recent one, last year, 2022, Meta, Facebook, before they changed the names, essentially bet 1/3 of the market cap that the metaverse was the big thing. Now, I'm not saying it's not the big thing, but I am saying it wasn't the big thing this year as they expected in 23. Therefore, they bet 1/3 of their market cap. So it's not about prediction. So future-proofing is then not about today into the future extrapolation. It's not about prediction. What is the other way? Well, there's another way around this, which is called backcasting. And backcasting is unlike forecasting, which is today into the future. Backcasting is saying, how do we pick a point in the future? What does it world look like 5 years, 10 years hence? Ignore what we're doing right now. How do we understand that future and then build that today, right? So it's not about, think about a cone where the narrow end of the cone is today and the wide end of the cone is in the future. That's horizon scanning, that's foresight, etc. It's the other way around. It's about saying the narrow part of the cone is in the future and the wide end is today, and you work backwards from the future, hence backcasting. That also is not perfect, but that's where you start tying in things like vision and course correction and about understanding this is where we want to go and how do we build that. Now, a big part of this conversation is for entrepreneurs. Implicitly, this is what entrepreneurs do. They say, how do you create a future yet unthought? How do you create a world that we can't see today? And how do we start building that business? So even though it's done almost implicitly, that is a better way of future-proofing yourself. The problem is when you hold that thing as the holy grail of where we need to be, it needs to be a North Star. So it's about understanding where you're going in the future, what do you want to be, and then remaining resilient and flexible to change that as we go along.
Great. So that's amazing. How do I manage the tension between my desired future and what's feasible?
How do you manage between your desired future and what's feasible? Yes. I think that question by implication puts these two things on the opposite end of the spectrum. Almost like saying you're only able to manage something and the desired state is opposite. Right? That's what your question implies. Now, I may be reading that incorrectly, right? I don't think it's a question of opposite ends of the spectrum. I think it's about saying, how do I manage and where do I want to be? It's on a spectrum. Number one, it's on a spectrum. Number two, it's about saying, what are the resources around where I want to be and what I can manage? Now, there's going to be a gap. Definitively, there's a gap, which is why it's a future unthought. It's unknown. The question, like a lot of planning in life, is not about how do I get there faster. It's about how do I get there smarter, right? Now, what that means can be interpreted in different ways. Let me give you, by way of analogy, let me give you an example of someone who may be listening to this thing right now saying, that's cool, we're talking about the future, we're talking about entrepreneurship, etc. But I don't know what I want to do with my life. Right? So I'm sure there's going to be many listeners. Yeah. There's other people who know, I want to be an engineer, I want to be this, I want to be whatever the case may be. There are likely also going to be folks who say, that's fantastic if you know what you want. I don't know what I want. How do I choose? To answer that question is the same as managed versus where I want to go, is then about saying, how do you make decisions predicated around giving you more choices? So it's about increasing your choice set. It's about increasing your end value versus decreasing. Why? Because the more choices you have, the more ability you have to make smarter choices as a continuation thereof. The natural implication of this is that you will have more regrets than not, which is fine, right? So an indicator that you have more choices, paradoxically, is the ability to have more regrets, which is something people don't think about. To come back to your question then, what does it mean around the managed and the future? It's increasing the number of choices that you have today to allow you to get to the end point smarter, not necessarily quicker. Choices give you that ability. So that's the first theoretical piece. The second piece is understanding where you are today and who needs to get there. What are the requirements to get to that point in time? Okay? And those requirements are not always best served by yourself. How do I build up an ecosystem? How do I build up partners? How do I create that stuff that I need, those resources, by leveraging off my networks? And how do I create that very quickly? Right? So how do you understand that? And the third one, between managed and where I want to go, what underpins that is the assumption that I add value. That's the assumption. This is where a lot of entrepreneurs go wrong. They fall in love with their own BS, right? And so the question becomes, on that spectrum between managed and expected, how much of that are you actually creating value? And it's real value, not perceived value. Understanding those things, I think, is a starting point. There is no magic formula to say where I go with managed and expected. It's about saying, how do I understand the route to market, the route to success, whatever your case may be? How do I track those things, but then also have the ability to be reflexive? And when I say reflexive, I don't mean agility. I mean being able to reflect upon. So it's reflectivity, not reflexivity.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Let's break it down for a 5-year-old, maybe 15-year-old entrepreneur who's in the informal sector. Let's break it down. How do I cultivate a culture of innovation and creativity? How do I ensure that, yes, I have an informal business, but I'm trying to grow that business into a business that can actually compete on a global scale?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we break it down? How do I achieve some innovative, creative thing? Yes. So the first thing, and again, this is contrary to what a lot of people say, right? My belief is there's terms like innovation, creativity, now digital, disruption. These are terms that are bandied about left, right, and center. Everyone talks about it. I'm innovative because I've changed my logo from red to blue. No, you're not. You've done it. You've done a color palette.
Yeah.
I'm innovative because I've changed the packaging from square to rectangular. No, you're not. Right. First of all, it's about deeply understanding what does innovative and creative actually mean. Right. I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole different conversation altogether.
Yeah.
These kinds of questions, when I'm asked this, are great academic and intellectual exercises to ask. If you're an informal entrepreneur, trust me, you're not caring about innovation and creativity by and large. You're thinking about survival. You're an informal person, and there's one of two ends of the spectrum that you fall as an entrepreneur. One is a necessity entrepreneur, the other one is an opportunity entrepreneur. When you have a look at something called the Total Entrepreneurial Index, TEA, right, which is a research study that's done by London Business School as well as my alma mater, Babson College, right? They essentially gauge and they say, what is the entrepreneurial activity rate around different countries around the world? And they found through research is that there's two kinds of entrepreneurs. There's two kinds of entrepreneurs, necessity and opportunity entrepreneurs, right? The opportunity entrepreneurs are the ones that have the ability to choose to do something else. So they have the ability to choose to go into corporate, to work for someone else, but they have options. They don't have to be an entrepreneur. Those are options. Those are the one set of entrepreneurs. The other set of entrepreneurs are called necessity entrepreneurs. They have no option. They can't move into the formal education space or the rather formal employment space, right? So by necessity, they become entrepreneurs. In South Africa, that number is highly weighted towards necessity entrepreneurs versus opportunity entrepreneurs just because of the economic climate that we're in, right? Don't ask me the numbers. I haven't seen the latest report, but it wouldn't surprise me if the ratio is 2-to-1, even 3-to-1. What that then says is, to your question, the formal entrepreneur forms part of the necessity entrepreneurs. Therefore, it's definitively about survival and about making sure I have some kind of income or revenue or something at the end of the month. Then the stuff around questions like innovation and creativity becomes a question that isn't really that necessary. The real question is, do you add value? That's right, and that's the point that I made before. And how do you know you add value? By two metrics. The first is by saying, do I have a customer that's willing to pay me for stuff? Now, that may be a spaza shop in the sense that now you know that you've got the right kind of pricing. So I am now selling the sweet at the right amount. I'm selling this fruit and veg at the right amount, not more than what someone's down the street, right? So that's the first regulation around value creation. The other question is not just around pricing and customer attribution. The question is, when you think about beyond that, not only is it about the thing that I'm selling, but how much opportunity for revenue exchange does that create? When you think about an informal entrepreneur, the value of a rand isn't 1 rand. Economic theory tells us. The value of a rand is worth how many times it changes hands. So by the same question then holds true is in the situation around value creation, people buying your stuff, but also the stuff that they buy, what is the consumption pattern of that? How many times can it be used over and over again? Therefore, what I'm saying then is we're splitting out creativity and innovation because it becomes an often used phrase.
Yeah.
If you will ask me about that from a necessity entrepreneur, that's a different question. But by and large, the data shows us that is not going to be, by and large, it's not going to be your township entrepreneur.
So when you look at South Africa, I think we have a paucity of entrepreneurs. I think there's a lack of entrepreneurs who are innovative, entrepreneurs who are actually solving actual problems. I think my question for you is, how then do we solve that? How then do we, when people are looking to start spaza shops and coffee shops, which are, yes, provide value, but in the greater scheme of things, in terms of solving the major problems we have, aren't actually solving those problems?
So I'm going to push back on this question, and let me be a little bit provocative. What is the data that shows you that we have got a lack of innovation in those kinds of entrepreneurs? What is the data that supports that? Right? And let me be clear. I think the general consensus is by and large that because that's what we see. So I suspect that if you did an actual study, what you will find that there are more spaza shop owners, etc., that kind of stuff versus truly innovative. But I think the point around saying we haven't got them, I think that's a flawed misconception. Okay, what I think is we have a challenge around biases, and the biases that we have around saying when you think about that caliber of entrepreneurs which you're alluding to, we're thinking about we are the guys that are creating the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas of this world, right? I think that's more or less the question. That's actually the way I interpret this question. That is a wholly unfair question, because even if you were to look at an advanced economy, right? You can call it the US, you can have a look at China, you can look at Europe, you can have a look at whatever. How many of those come through? And let's use a back of the envelope, well, not back of the envelope, but let's use a litmus equivalent, right? The equivalent of a unicorn, a $1 billion valuation. Right? How many of them are there that come through? Now, the numbers show that this is increasing, right? But within Africa, there's not many. Now, the answer is, but Craig, you've just contradicted yourself. Here's the point. The point is innovation doesn't equal market cap. Innovation doesn't equal gigantic Silicon Valley kind of guys. What it does equal is innovation. Again, I come back to the definition. How do you define as innovative? Because at a grassroots level right now, there are entrepreneurs doing cool stuff, which may not be classed as innovation in that level, right?
Yeah.
But there are guys doing some great stuff around upcycling, recycling. There's great local solutions. There's guys doing lighting solutions. There's guys doing incredible things. At the coffee that I was just at right now, guys creating products around flame retardant township housing, right? So yes, it's not the, hey man, this is going to be the next Amazon or the next Jumia or Shutterfly or whatever you want to call it, that kind of thing. But there is innovation. And again, that's why I push back very hard against these points that I hear other people speak about, where they say, but we don't have the innovation, we don't have this. Tell me, what is innovation, number one? Number two, on the spectrum of things, do we prefer innovative businesses or do we prefer businesses that create jobs? What do we need right now? Now, they're not mutually exclusive. They're definitely not mutually exclusive. Yeah. But a lot of the questions are flawed questions because we're looking for the sexiness, we're looking for the glamour. Yeah. They're not the right questions.
That's true. What emerging technologies would you say we should pay attention to right now?
You're talking about in general around technology and how do we think about these things in the context of the future?
Yes.
So I'll give you some thoughts, but again, I have to give the precursor. This is not about prediction, right? It's not about prediction. So if anyone out there that's listening to this is saying, Craig said this, go to that, no. Okay. So the first is I want to draw your attention to something called the Gartner hype curve. I don't know if you've heard about the Gartner hype curve, right? Yes. So Gartner tracks, for those listeners that don't know, a Gartner research company tracks what's called a hype cycle of many emerging technologies over time. And on that, what you see a very nice bell curve distribution that drops off very quickly. Then it hits what's called a trough of disillusionment, and then it comes back up again, right? So that's research study that these guys have done. The challenge is when you have a look at a lot of the stuff that the quote-unquote sexy futurists go for, is they pick a lot of stuff that is sexy and topical that's at the top of the hype curve, hence the name hype curve. So the hype answers are things like, obviously, artificial intelligence. It's stuff like quantum. It's stuff like blockchain. You may hear stuff that guys are starting to emerge around DNA sequencing, around healthcare, biocare, health tech, all that kind of stuff, right? So I think those things, by and large, again, if you were to ask me that question in isolation, what's hype versus what I see, those are the obvious questions. I think there's a few other ones that are more pressing, though. And one is not the singular approach around saying this technology is going to be transformative. It's about saying what's the combination of these different technologies. So it's the question around combinatorials. So it's a question of something like saying, how do you tie in artificial intelligence, blockchain, and IoT? How do you use those things that form resonance with each other to create a better kind of future, right? From a pure, if you were to push me and you were to hold a gun to my head and say, Craig, pick some technologies right now that I think are super duper important. Again, the question's flawed because we also have to ask what time horizon. So if the question, which technology would you invest in between, I don't know, now and 3 years? AI. It's a no-brainer. You're going to invest in AI right now, right? Blockchain technologies, I think, is a little bit further on, right? But by way of analogy, 5 years from now, if we're talking about AI, you'd be like, this guy is, he's so old school. Why are you talking about it? It's the same as a lot of the work I do with corporates right now globally. They talk about digitization. If you think about digitization, man, you're so far out of it already because digitization is a third industrial age technology. It's not fourth industrial revolution. The same thing by implication. Your question is flawed because it's about saying which technology should we look out for over what time frame. But again, the question is for why. So when you think about that, that forms the question differently. In the long future, and when I say long future, let's limit between 5 and 10 years, I think healthcare is a big one. Healthcare is gigantic, all the way from longevity to reaching, I don't know if we ever get something called escape velocity, where you live longer than the number of years that you actually age by. But I think within the realm of health tech, it's interesting because it merges essentially a lot of mankind's intrinsic requirements and desires, our innate desires to leave a legacy and live longer. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's emerging around that. So then we look at things like CRISPR, we look at augmentation, we look at customized medicines, we look at eugenics, we look at cyber and augmentation of human beings. That's when things become really, really interesting. But I think that's the longer future. The short term, AI is going to be the big one. I think if you're talking, dare I say it, if you're talking about digitization right now, if you're talking about IoT, I think you're a little bit behind the curve already. Into the medium term, I think there's still a lot of work around decentralized stuff, whether it's decentralized currencies, whether it's the use of blockchain and realizing those kinds of potentials. I think there's a bigger future around augmented reality versus virtual reality in the medium term. There are other, I'm sure without a doubt, there's other folks that you've had on this that are exceptionally bullish around VR and around the metaverse, and they will broadly and boldly predict that this is going to be the future. Ask them what time frame, because it's easy as a futurist to say it will be the future of, and when you don't meet that, you say, well, that's how good I am, and if it does, you say that's how good I am. Right? The fact of the matter is this: the question is again flawed, because it's not about prediction. It's about saying how do you create future strategies which allow you to use the technologies in a way that optimizes whatever you want to solve for. So what's your solve for X problem, and then using these technologies for that.
The reason why I like you is that you're different from other futurists, and your approach is definitely different, which is what I like. Is it that the sexy answers are more applicable to the first world countries, because obviously they are experiencing different problems than we are down here? And if I'm hearing you correctly, is that you're saying that it depends based on where you are in the context of what you're currently experiencing and the value that is needed in that economy?
Yeah, so there's a few things baked within your question. The first is the shift away from countries to cities. A lot of folks don't get that, right?
Wow.
The economy of Johannesburg is bigger than the economy of a lot of countries.
Wow.
If you look at a country level, right, and you can pick any country that you want, the capital cities drive significantly more revenue, GDP growth, job creation than the country as a whole, right? So if you were to pick Nairobi, Lagos, Cairo, Johannesburg, Cape Town, those cities probably drive individually more revenue and job creation than many other countries. So the framing is flawed. And again, this is the challenge around other folks. And again, whether you want to call them futurists, whether they're economists, whether they're business folks, there's a perception when people don't ask the right questions. And I'm not saying it's not a useful proxy, it's not a useful guide. I'm saying when you think about a comparative analysis, there's a huge shift away from country analysis towards city analysis. So that's the first point. The second point then, which is embedded within that, is a lot of the stuff that you see around technology adoption is based off a dual binomial distribution curve, so a bell curve distribution, right?
Yeah.
And what that basically means is when you look at the big cities, the mega cities of which there's going to be 61 mega cities with more than, what was the number, 10 million people in Africa by 2030, whatever the number is, whatever the definition is, right? But the point is, when you think about that binomial distribution, double binomial distribution, what it shows that within cities, you're likely going to have an uptake of technology, and in the rural areas it depends. Because in rural areas, we're still dependent upon last mile connectivity, or maybe now last centimeter connectivity, because of things like space around Elon Musk satellite technology stuff, right? So you don't need that last mile, it's the last millimeter around connectivity stuff. So that's the first point around the comment that you make. The second comment around first world versus third world, now your question becomes even more irrelevant when you think about countries versus cities. Because by and large, when you start looking at the mega cities, by and large, by what I just said right now, drive more revenue than countries. The same thing could be said that then the big cities in a developing country, right, whether it's South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, whatever you pick, the big capital cities there, again, are likely then going to be the same kind of economic drivers as mid-tier cities of first world. Now the question is fundamentally flawed. Because now it's no longer about first versus third, developing versus developed. It's no longer that question. You can see very quickly the question changes. It's around cities which are a proxy around resource amalgamation and access to stuff. Around the world of technology, the fundamental cornerstone of all these emerging technologies is both electricity and connectivity.
Wow.
So the question now changes. But the big one is exactly as you've alluded to, predicting the use case and dependability of technologies is a flawed exercise because of the examples that I gave you, right?
Yeah.
And there's many, many more. All the way from the more traditional ones we just spoke about right now, of Meta, a la Facebook, all the way through to the more traditional ones of a Nokia, of an Airbnb, of a Kodak. All of those things are flawed examples of prediction of technologies. Again, the underlying question is why, not what. Where I differ from my colleagues in the space is that you're right, it is sexy. It's very sexy to use an approach that futurists use, which is called horizon scanning, and you pick one thing which seems super duper sexy and you craft a wonderful narrative, because many folks in this era are great storytellers and they're great entertainers. And so they craft a narrative around the what without appreciating the why. And more importantly, the how, the context that's going to be used, whether it's an entrepreneur, whether it is a big organization. It's about appreciating that thing. If you track the talks of a lot of futurists, you'll see a very interesting thing. One is the same stuff that they've spoken about for the last 5 years. Okay? Because it's easy and it's sexy and it's the same kind of stuff. That's number one. Yeah. Or you have conversely the other thing, completely contrary to that one. It's completely just new stuff all the time. New stuff. What's the consistency there? The consistency there is chasing the what. We need to be moving into a question of how. How do you think about the future differently is more important than what does the future look like.
Wow, that's good. That's really good. So it's about how we see the future, not what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, because what is prediction, right? So what is prediction? And you bet your house, theoretically, maybe even practically, if you're Zuckerberg now, obviously you can see a lot of money to spend, right? Yeah. But no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are, a third of your value has disappeared. If you want to play that game and you want to go bet, cool, by all means, I'm not stopping you, right? But fundamentally, that is the dangerous game that a lot of folks play when they go down the path around what does the future hold, what should I bet on?
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I have a question for you. How do we redefine value? How do we redefine value?
It's simple. Value is not defined by you.
Wow.
This is the paradox of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs start with an idea. They start and say, here's the thing that I have. It ends up being a product, service, or otherwise, or mixed, or platform, or whatever the case may be, right? And they say, this is what the thing is. Then they go into the marketplace. Well, maybe they don't, but most actually don't do that. They say, here's the idea. Let's go develop it. Let's go do, if you're lucky, some light analysis, whether it's market research or customer interviews, whatever, right? But they go and they spend time developing this thing. Then they go back and they iterate and they go, oh, you know what else we can do? We can do this and this and this. Then they go and they ask their buddies or their family. They go, oh, this is amazing. And because people love you and they care for you, they say, that's amazing. And then you spend years sinking money, time into this thing. And then you hit the market. And you go to the market and you say, hey, man, would you buy, would you this? And the guy goes, no, not really. And then what do these entrepreneurs go? This guy's not smart enough to use my product. They don't know what it can actually do for them. In that scenario, in that context, value is determined by the entrepreneur, which, as you can see in this very short example, is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because there's no uptake. Value is never created by the entrepreneur. Let me rephrase it. Value is never dictated by the entrepreneur. Value is created by the entrepreneur, but it's dictated by your marketplace, by your customer. The only way you create value is by asking the end consumer if they're going to buy it and will they buy it. That's the only definition of value. All this other kind of stuff around, I'm going to make it because there's unmet need. And yes, Craig, but when you look at what Steve Jobs did, he created the iPod, there was no market. Yeah, you could Henry Ford on the car, etc. Yeah. Sure, product-based, but when you scratch below the surface and you understand how to surface unmet needs, the customer still decides value. Why? Because ultimately the customer is the purchaser and the acquirer of your goods or service.
Yeah,
it's determined by the customer, but you create it.
Okay, how didn't you manage the tension between your customer, your Smith Corona, your customer is still buying typewriters,
cool,
but the world around you is shifting. How do you then manage that tension between providing the value that your customer needs, but also having to shift into the new world?
So the first is, again, by asking, the old question, right? The old question of when you buy a drill bit. Let me ask this question. When you buy a drill, what are you buying? When you buy a drill, what are you buying?
I'm buying a drill.
No, you're not. You're buying a hole. When you buy a drill, you're buying a hole. That's actually what you want.
Wow.
Right? The drill is a medium to create that hole. If you buy a typewriter, what are you buying?
I'm buying efficiency in terms of with the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a medium of exchange.
Yeah.
It's capturing of data, whatever the case may be. The typewriter is a means to get there, just like the drill is a means to get the hole. Now, when you understand that, you understand what is the value that you create. I can create a hole by buying a hammer. I can create the hole by using less bricks. To answer your question then is about, again, by asking why. And this is the fundamental point I keep pushing, right? Why are you investing in this technology? Why do you want to do this? The customer wants a hole. They don't want a drill. The drill is the medium to get you there.
Yeah.
Right? Now, by implication then, all these technologies, whatever it may be, hence my point before also, what gets you there smarter? What gets the customer the ability to create that hole smarter than anything else? Right now, it seems like when a cost-benefit analysis, it's a drill, and by implication, a drill bit. You cannot say to me that if the pricing was the same, all things considered, pricing, availability, etc., that you would not use a laser versus a drill.
Yeah.
Same question as a typewriter. Why are you using a typewriter if, like today, I can do a voice note and transcription? Why am I using a voice note and transcription if I can do a brain upload? Why am I using a brain upload if I could consciously just read your thoughts? Why? Because we're asking why do we need this stuff versus the medium, which is the what versus the why and the how.
You've literally just changed my perspective on how I saw things. For a very long time, I always saw it as you need to shift what you are giving your customer based on where the world is. But what you're saying is that you actually need to focus on the medium that you are providing, because that's basically, it doesn't matter to the customer because they have a need. Wow.
What's their, like, why?
Wow.
Why do they need a drill? Literally, as I said, you're buying a drill bit for what? You are buying it for the hole. You're not buying for the drill and the consequent drill bits. You're buying it for the hole. Now, the same thing holds true now. You can see what I meant by these other points, right? Value then by definition is dictated by the customer, right? You can create that, but fundamentally the value is determined by the customer, and how you then determine how to make that whole is a different story altogether.
Yeah.
Right? Same as the typewriter, same as artificial intelligence, same as quantum, same as virtual reality, same thing. What is it that the problem is that they have, and how you solve it is the medium of exchange, which you can then use differently.
Definitely. So my previous guest left a question for you.
Sure.
And the question, I'm going to try and paraphrase. The question is, if you were speaking to a 15-year-old and you were telling them what to do, you're advising them on how to prepare for the future, live their life, what would you say to them?
I was giving a presentation to a corporate yesterday. I won't mention their name. And around this, I was merging a number of personal stories and the personal journey I've gone through, then merging it within the futures thing, right? I'll give you three things that there's probably a whole bunch more, but let me just pick up three for this 15-year-old, okay? And the first piece of advice I would give them is this. You can be anything you want, but you can't be everything.
Wow.
Okay? So you can be anything, because the world right now is one of choices. It's one of bandwidth. There's a lot of optionality right now. So you can be anything, but we're still only limited by 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, maybe 100 years. Okay? So you still have a limit. There's still a maximum limit until we get to some of the stuff I spoke about around, like longevity and living forever, right? So one is you need to choose and say, okay, cool, within that spectrum of things that I want, I can be anything I want, but I can't be everything I want. By implication, then it ties into the other thing that I said before, which is around saying that by implication, if you have the ability to choose, you will have regrets. So part of this question is then about saying, and this is one of the first point, is about saying then how do you not minimize the number of regrets? Because you will have regrets irrespective of the fact, because it's an open loop system. But it's about saying, how do I maximize the chances of success by determining that backcasting approach even in your life? Now, kids do this all the time. They say, when you grow up, ask them, What do they want to be? I want to be president. I want to be a fireman. I want to be an astronaut, whatever, right? So it's that backcasting approach. It's picking a point in the future and then working backwards from there. So the first part is about realizing you can be anything you want, but you can't be everything you want. And by implication, you're going to have regrets. So choose the regrets that you want. That's number one. Number two is about saying then within that process, within that paradigm, ensure that you're picking times to reflect. A lot of people, what happens is life catches them very quickly. You're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, you're 15, 16 years old right now, you're top of the world, you're about to finish high school. If you're finishing high school and you're lucky enough to get to university, right? The world is your oyster, you're invincible at that age and you know everything. If you're not careful and you don't reflect very often, the next thing you realize is that you're 40, 50, 60-year-old, 2 kids with double mortgage, whatever the case may be, and you have achieved nothing in life. And when I say nothing, I use the term very broadly. And when I say nothing, I mean you haven't achieved that end goal that you thought you're going to be. So what you need to do is you need to build in a process of reflexivity. You need to point on a page of saying, how do we think about what we've achieved and what I want to achieve, and how do I course correct to get there smarter? Again, advice that I've given through the course of this interview, right? How do you ensure that there's a way to say, where do I want to be? How do I get back on track in terms of where I be? Which means making hard decisions. By making hard decisions, like the first point, you by implication have regrets. That's the second thing. The last thing I'd say is this. Do as many things as you can, right? So it's very much the first point. But do as many things as you can. Why? Because you really have options right now. In the past, you had less options. Do many things. Now, this is on 2 levels. It's on the personal level around experiencing, about being a young person, about saying, let me see the world, about saying, there's a time quotient over here as well. People say, you can do anything whenever you want. Sure, that's lovely, lovely Instagram knowledge. I can tell you right now, if you climb Everest as a 25-year-old versus climbing Everest as an 80-year-old, you're going to have a lot of an easier time. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying there is a time-bound thing over here. I can almost guarantee you will never become a professional footballer by the age of 40. Never. If you start that journey at the age of 40, almost no chance, right? So there is a time-bound thing over here. So do as many things as you can from a personal perspective, learn, experience, understand those things. But even from a career point of view, what that is that ties into a theory that I heard, and I've adopted this from when I was in the US. It was said to me by a guy called Professor Andy Hargadon. And what he said was very true. It says there's a misconception, to tie into your point, there's a misconception around you need to think outside the box. So flawed. You don't think outside the box. You think within multiple boxes. Wow. Why? Because what does it mean? It means you understand something that works from one domain and apply it into another domain. By implication, what does it mean? It means to be successful in life in a world that, to your first question, that's changing so rapidly. It's about understanding that the world is changing so quickly, so I need to have a myriad of experiences to apply that knowledge into certain contexts and certain domains. That is innovation. Right? Invention is about the creation of something new. Innovation is about applying that invention into a context where it becomes useful. That's the definition of invention. Wow. Right? Innovation. And so by implication, the more experiments you can do, the more things that you can experience over time, the more boxes you have to think within, the more value that you can create because you can see more things from other places. Those are the 3 pieces of advice I would give.
Wow. And what question would you ask the next guest?
Am I allowed to mention the next guest?
You can. Yeah.
Yeah. So your next guest is Dion Chang, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
a colleague and a friend of mine in this space. And so this is going to be a specific question for him because, I won't give away too much of what he's doing right now.
Okay.
But in some of the stuff that he's doing right now, I would ask him, what are the 3 biggest lessons he's learnt from people that have reached the end of their lives?
Wow.
What are the 3 lessons that he's learned from people that have reached the end of their lives?
Well, can I ask you the same question?
Oh, my word. So I didn't know you were going to ask me that question. So let me give you the first one. The first one is when you're sitting there, you already know because you're gone, right? But if you're in the coffin, if you're in that wooden box and the wooden box gets closed, what do people say about you? They're not going to say, this is the career that he had. Great employee, great manager. They might say some of your achievements. I started a business, did this, all this other kind of stuff. You climbed Kilimanjaro, whatever, right? They might say that. But the most important thing that people are going to say about you is the memory that they have of you is by implication how you made them feel. Right? So the first advice I'd say is ensure that you add value to people's lives by something that I heard a guy called Rich Mulholland. If you ever get a chance to interview him, he's fantastic. Wow. But he said something fantastic. He said, in your life, you're interviewing for a bigger role in someone else's movie. Powerful, right? So that's the
Yeah.
first thing I'd say. I'd say do that. Ensure that you are interviewing for a bigger role. By implication, you have better memories, or you leave people with better memories of you. So I think that's the first piece of advice that I have. The second thing is, and this ties into the kind of stuff that I said before, is you know you're going to have regrets. That is the definition of a life well lived, because it means that you had choices. If you every day only if you could only eat, and then you only knew about a world where you could only eat an egg sandwich, you only ate an egg sandwich. But if you have the ability to choose multiple options from a menu, by implication, you have regret. Yeah. It means it's an indicator. A life of regrets is a life of choice. But it's not about living in that world. It's not about living in those regrets. It's about saying, I've chosen the best thing that I thought at that time, and that's okay. So that's the second thing. The third thing, the last piece of advice that I'd give, and it ties all these different pieces together, is don't live a life only for yourself. And in a world that's driven by this whole me thing, it's about me first. It's about, it's about my desires, it's about my thing, and all this other kind of stuff. Sure, there's a place for that, but by and large, no. Specifically within an African and a South African context, live your life in a way that brings others with you on a journey. Now, please, I'm not saying that you have to be Mother Teresa and Gandhi and, go sell your... I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is when you think about the journey that you're on, be inclusive of others as part of that journey. It may be something as simple as doing a podcast like this. It may be, sure, and in the spectrum, you sell your goods, fine. But by and large, think about others and what is the value attribution that you have into other people's lives. Think about this life as a connectedness, and it's the old knowledge, whether you want to call it Ubuntu, whether you want to call it togetherness, all that kind of stuff. What is the value add that you're giving to those around you, which drive the memories, which also by implication means that they and you have regrets.
That's amazing. Well, we've come to the end of the podcast, but I'm going to give you 60 seconds to speak to the people. Any message, any parting thoughts that you have? You have a mic over here. You can look at the... you have a camera over here, not a mic. You have a camera over there. You can go ahead and speak to people.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I've had a lot of good fun. So 60 seconds, the final advice that I'd give you is really to say embrace the world we're in right now. Not, it's very easy to be despondent. It's very easy to say right now the world is terrible and it's not going to get any better. That's a term for that. It's called nostalgia. But it's not that. It's about saying, how do you think about the world differently? Because your perception drives your reality. So how do you see the world in a way that says, this is a good place. It's a great place. The world is fraught of problems and challenges, but it can also be full of opportunities. So see the world and choose to see the world as one of opportunity. See the world as one of full of kindness. See the world as one that you can make a difference, because your perception ultimately creates that reality, right? And that's true not only because I know it's true because of its lived experience, but once you start speaking about it, your words become your actions and one becomes many. That's my advice that I'd give.
Well, there you have it. Thank you very much, Craig, for joining us. Really appreciate it. There you have it. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you.
I'm so mad, so I'm making a difference. I'm so mad.